So those people who want to go downstairs to level 5 can go now and talk school libraries and PD. So school libraries here or PD. Or anything else you'd like to talk about.
I'm going to go to PD and talk about like stretching your qualifications. PD too, because we're very good. Okay, good.
Sounds good.
Because I know that we're recording, Bonnie. That'll be good.
Okay, so introducing the wonderful Bonnie Wildie, I was going to say Bonnie Tyler, quite work, who is from New South Wales State Archives but has a history in all sorts of places, including libraries and including TAFE. So, Bonnie.
Thank you. I will sort of preface this by saying that this is myself. I'm not representing my organisation, so these are ideas, thoughts, all else just coming from me as a person who works in GLAM. Okay, so just keep that in mind as we go through. So today we're going to look at critical making, rethinking access and engagement in GLAM. And I'm going to start off with turning this on. I'm going to start off with this. Do we recognise this image?
Yep.
Yeah, and what's the sort of poignant thing in this image? Yeah, that sea of pink, right? That sea of pink. The pussy hat, right? So this is the Washington Women's March, and it was a protest against Trump. And Sally, I'm moving all over the place. I'm going to stand still. But the reason why I've brought this up is because this is both an analog and a digital movement, right? So it's analog in that it's got physicality, doesn't it? But the way that it was distributed, the way that people engaged with it, was in a very digital way. So I want us to sort of keep in mind that that analog and digital is not mutually exclusive, but of course that they interrelate as we move through some of our understanding in this presentation around engagement and access and measuring that in GLAM. Okay? The other reason why I wanted to bring it up is to remind us of the subversive nature of textile. So throughout history, textile or the clothes that we wear have the power to be subversive. We understand the cultural aspects of what we wear and we're able to subvert them. Okay, so that sort of gives you an understanding or a background of where we're going to go with this presentation. What I will ask you to do, if you've got your phones out, and you can get them out right now, is to tweet at the Victoria and Albert Museum. So they actually put the pussy hat into their collection as part of their rapid response collecting strategy, so to capture things sort of in the here and now. So why don't we give a shout out to what they do, and I've got their handle up there, so it's at v_and_a. So thank you, V and A. And if you like, you can use the unifying hashtag to make sure that we can group all of this later on. So for those at home, we're tweeting, you can tweet along too. All right, have we got that? Beautiful. All right, what I'm going to do is get us to move along. So the first part that I'm going to talk about is wearing access, hashtag redaction art. And hopefully these images are familiar to you. Has everyone seen this? Yeah. Some of you have seen it, some of you haven't. So what these are redactions. So these conceal pieces of information that we're not able to know. So for instance, we aren't able to know the name of that regional director, okay? But the story of how these emerged and the way that we engaged with them has some really important lessons for us in GLAM when it comes to digital access and understanding and measuring impact and engagement. So I want us to thank the National Archives because what those redactions are redactions that come from ASIO files. So the National Archive has digitised ASIO files and put them up online. So let's thank the National Archives for what they do. You don't have to acknowledge the cuts that they've recently suffered in the latest budget. That's just something I've thrown in. But if we can say thank you to the National Archives of Australia. Beautiful, so we're saying thank you. And I'm just going to move us along to redaction art. So while we are using records from the National Archives of Australia, we are actually connecting into someone's research with that work. And that person is Tim Sherratt. Has everyone come across Tim Sherratt? Yes, yes, if you're working in GLAM, generally you have. So what he did was harvest the digitised ASIO files from the National Archives. Okay, so keep that in mind, that we have actually now removed the records from their institution. So they're no longer in the institution, they've been removed out. He then developed a program to identify the redactions in those records. So the redactions are where someone has gone through and taken out information that we're not allowed to know. Before we move on, let's thank Tim Sherratt for his work. So I was at a conference a few weeks ago, and Tim Sherratt's work, in one way or the other, even though he wasn't there, came up in 4 of the presentations that were delivered on that day. So it's really difficult to deny how important his work is to how we interact with records at the moment. Okay, so we've had that acknowledgement. So we'll just jump into how redaction art works. So what you can see here is one of the first tweets that he put out about his work. So this is a record, and you can see the redactions in that record, and you can see that this is him sort of testing out how that program is going to work. So looking for redactions, this looks better. Okay, so this is what we're typically thinking redactions are going to look like, right? They're just black lines through text. But then the unexpected started to happen, and we can see here, I think I'll have to create an exhibition of artistic splodges. Okay, so he's starting to get things come through that are really unexpected, but what they also do is reveal the people behind the process. Okay, so looks like the person doing the redactions was getting a bit bored, and so they've turned that redaction into a ship. There was some argument when I delivered this at a conference whether that was actually a cemetery. I was like, that's a bit dark, crikey. But regardless, we're starting to get, it's a ship? Is that confirmed, Rob?
Yeah, I'm on that ship.
Yeah, cool. Sausage dog? So let's just take a look at that timestamp as well. So that's 12:48, it's a little late. And this is where we start to get the hashtag redaction art emerging. Now that unifying hashtag is going to be really important as we move through this story. So we've got the sausage dog appearing, and we've got the ship. So at 1:04, Tim's thinking, okay, it's time for bed. But look at how good this boat is, and we can all agree that it's a pretty great boat. So what this was showing is it's revealing that human process. It shows the person behind, something that is often seen as quite faceless with regards to information access. So what Tim did is he collated what he termed redaction art, so the really cute little critters, and he collated them and put them out there for people to use. Okay, so again, really important. He's gathered these elements together. He said, use them. Okay, so no question around copyright or any of those kind of things that maybe we see in our own institutions where copyright's not clear, we put it back on the user to ascertain. He's cleared that for us and said, here you go, use these. And he's also created a hashtag that unifies the movement together, okay? So we have an invitation to do what we want. So we start to get these records manifesting physically, right? We've got a redaction art tattoo. We've got redaction art brooches. Does anyone have one of these? No? I have one, I didn't wear it today. We start to get 3D printed cookie cutters, okay? So is anyone here from the University of Wollongong at all? No?
I can see it from my office.
There you go. Perhaps you could see the 3D printers working away. So we've got these being built in their maker spaces. And we also had some 3D printed cookie cutters that made it from WA to Canberra and then on to Wollongong. You know, so we had these doing the rounds. We had biscuits being made. Yeah. We had biscuits being made. So these were distributed at the DH Pathway 17, where Tim was talking about his research and his work with these records. So again, I want you to keep in mind that we're having a very physical response to these digitised records. We get an exhibition that comes through as well. So I was really inspired by Tim's sharing of these and the invitation to make your own, okay? So you guys no doubt will this afternoon jump in online to go and have a look at this to make your own redaction art, okay? I decided that I wanted to make something, and I thought I would utilise my skills to make a redaction art dress. So this is the redaction art dress, okay? And it's a custom printed dress that has the redactions printed on it. But it wasn't just, you know, something that I sort of thought of myself. I was inspired by this piece here. So has anyone come across the press dress before? Yeah, yes. So Matilda Butters wore the press dress in 1866 to a ball, a fancy dress ball, welcoming the new governor of the colony of Victoria, okay? And the skirt of the dress, the bodice no longer exists or hasn't been found, but the skirt of the dress is made from pages of the Melbourne newspapers, okay? And I'll go into it in a little bit, but before we move on, let's give thanks to the State Library of Victoria for not only keeping the press dress for us, but also doing the work they did extensive conservation work for us as well, so that it exists into our time. Beautiful. So this is a larger photo there of the press dress. So you can see the printed panels, okay? In the sides are the names of the regional newspapers. She wore this on the event. She wore it with a coronet that said "Freedom of the Press," and she also carried a functioning printing press, which she printed from throughout the night. On the second occasion she wore it, she had second edition sort of on the skirt, which I just love. But the whole point of this dress was to pronounce or proclaim the glory of the colony of Victoria to this new governor that was coming. So we have, you know, I mean, you don't wear a guy's face on your skirt unless you're trying to initiate conversation. So his head is down there, but you've also got the new town hall. So we're this progressive city and colony, and look at how fabulous we are. So this is a dress with meaning, okay? Remember how textiles can be used for those to imbue meaning. So what we have here is you can see that she's holding the printing press. So this is a sketch from the fancy dress ball. And you can also look up those newspapers in Trove. as well. So we get this continuity of history coming through. And what I'm going to ask you to do is to say thank you to Trove for like literally changing how we interact with history.
And they really have.
They really have. They absolutely have.
Unbelievable.
They absolutely have. Beautiful. All right, I'm going to just move us on a little bit. So then my sort of dress, I wanted to make it, you know, I wanted to join in the online conversation that was happening. So as I said, these records have manifested physically, but the conversation was happening online. We were linking with like-minded people in that online environment, unified by that hashtag. So on International Archives Day, Tim sort of put that statement out, do it yourself, here it is. And I responded with, I can't 3D print, but I can sew, okay? And then moving through with dress updates. So we now have pockets for all the secret things, and as we have spoken about previously, you know, pockets are political. So this sort of goes through, again, using that unifying hashtag to promote that dress, which you can see there. So this is you know, taking in or joining with that idea of the press dress and the idea of conversation. Okay, so when I wear this dress, I'm talking about not only redaction art, but issues of open access, surveillance, the work that we do in glam, that kind of thing. So it's a conversation piece. Which is why I thought it was really important to wear it to the Alia recreation that Sally personally scheduled for 8 AM on a...
I did not.
So it's quite a cold morning, but it was freezing. So who else is in this picture?
I was in bed.
You were there in spirit though, right?
No.
No.
I was definitely in bed in spirit.
So as part of the Alia 80 celebrations, the 80th anniversary of Alia, we did a recreation in front of Albert Hall. And I went, well, I have to wear the dress, don't I? I've got to get the dress in. The reason why I also wanted to get the dress in is because Metcalfe, do we know the name Metcalfe? Is that familiar? Yeah? Why is it familiar? Like the Metcalfe Award, yeah?
Isn't there an auditorium in the state library?
There is, because he was the state librarian at one point. So yes, so there is. But he was also instrumental in the creation of what became Alia, okay? This is his ASIO file.
Oh.
So ASIO, ASIO had surveillance on Metcalfe. Because Metcalfe had a habit of hanging around suspected communists, like Dr. Evatt, and hanging out with known feminists, like Jessie Street. And in this page here, which again you can look up on Trove, but this is from his digitised ASIO record, he suggested that libraries were a great alternative to propagandist bookshops. So that kind of stuff actually gets you noticed by ASIO, it turns out. So I thought it was very poignant that I should wear the dress that has the ASIO redactions to the recreation of the association that was started by Metcalfe, who was our state librarian under surveillance by ASIO. Okay, so I've called that a sort of cultural steganography. You know, it's that hidden message being placed in. It's a sort of Easter egg. I am there in the middle, holding the eye, the information in the redaction art dress. Okay.
I'm holding the two. Just
For and there it is on the annual report. Okay, so that photo made it onto the cover of the Alia annual report. So I'm just delighted to know that the redaction art dress is sitting in that photo. Okay, so all of those issues around surveillance, privacy, access to information, the digitisation of records, reuse, all of those issues sit in that tiny little photograph. Okay? These are some pictures of people wearing the badges. And I just want us to consider what it means to wear that badge. It means critical engagement with everything that is imbued in the redaction art movement. Okay? It is a sort of almost secret club, but to be admitted, we have to think critically. We have to have had that engagement with those records. So it's really powerful, I think. Now, I talked about that. I gave a longer version of this talk at the LCA 2018 conference. And it stemmed a lot of conversation, and it sort of flowed into a presentation that I'm going to talk about now. And that is the digitization of the dawn. And as you can imagine, hashtag dawn dress. It's what I'm wearing now. Ta-da! Oh my gosh.
Here's one I prepared earlier.
Yeah, how about that? So, this is one, it had many different banners, but this is one of the banners of the Dawn magazine. Is anyone familiar with the Dawn at all? Yes? Yes? Okay. So the Dawn was one of the earliest Australian feminist journals. It emerged in the late 1880s. So if we think about the 1880s and 1890s period, it's a period of social strife and class conflict. Okay, in the 1890s we have the emergence of we have labour rights, labour movement. We have the Great Strikes, and the collectivism there is incredible. So the shearers went out on strike, and in solidarity you get marine workers, so they wouldn't load boats at the dock. Coal workers turn out, gas stokers turn out. So you just have this sort of, the allyship of the labour movement. And of course what happens is that the government goes, well, we can't have this. They align with government employer groups to put down the Great Strikes, right? And the unions learn from that being a union isn't going to be enough. We need collective action, and you have the emergence of the Australian Labor Party, okay? We need to get into politics. So that emerges out of that period. We have the Bush legend emerge out of that period. So the writing of Henry Lawson and Banjo Paterson and the Heidelberg School of Art and what it is to be Australian sort of emerges out of this period. We have a lot of radical thinkers. So we have a group of Australians who are so put out by the putting down of the strike action that they say, well, socialism and communism is not going to work in Australia. We'll start New Australia in Paraguay. And they actually relocate and create Cosme. So there's a lot of radical thinking going on during this period, and it's from this period that the Dawn emerges. Now in 1888, Louisa Lawson put out the first issue. Is that a familiar name? Yeah. What do we most probably know her from?
Henry's mum.
Yeah, from being someone's mum, right? It's from being Henry Lawson's mum. But what Louisa was a working class woman in classless egalitarian Australia. Okay, she left a abusive husband and the real true hardships of the bush and came into Sydney. And she made a place for herself in radical Sydney. She was a socialist and she was very active in the labour rights movement of the period. But what she realised was that the women's rights movement was going to be a separate battle. So the labour rights movement and the women's rights movement had a really uneasy relationship, and arguably the labour rights movement was quite hostile to the women's movement. There was a fear that women would take men's jobs. Now remember that the 1890s is we're suffering a Great Depression, Great Drought, there is a crisis with work, so it's an uneasy tension that exists. So she decides to start the Dawn. This newspaper boldly declares itself as for women and to take on the issues that women have no control of at the moment. So she writes here, there has hitherto been no trumpet through which the concentrated voices of womankind could publish their grievances and their opinions. This is going to be that voice. On page 2, she writes about the divorce extension bill. So there are a few questions so important for the consideration of women as those of the laws of marriage and divorce. So this is a very political piece. She will go on throughout these pages to bring up issues of equal pay, of women's suffrage, of divorce, matrimonial laws. She will promote the work of women. So this is a list of new inventions patented by women. She will advocate for women to be more broadly in the public sphere. So really destroying that separation of private and public to suggest that women learn to cycle. So for us, that's not a big deal, but for them back then, it means challenging what you wear, redesigning what you wear, going against sort of public opinion as to what is suitable for women to wear, and it's also your own mode of transport. So this is incredibly subversive. She goes on to advocate for independence, yeah, bang on. She advocates for public speaking, and she actually puts together sort of public speaking groups where women can learn to speak in public. And she writes here, and just tell me if this is familiar to anyone, public speaking is seldom attempted by women unless they have something worthy to be said and know well how to say it. But man, though he offend the taste of his audience both in matter and manner, still considers it his prerogative to speak. I mean, yeah, I don't know how to say it. Nothing, no. So this is really interesting in what is coming through on these pages. Louisa Lawson was advocating for a female position against the gender and social norms of the time. This was her vehicle, this was the voice, and I like to, you know, in the words of sort of, I've been reading about the suffragettes, so the suffragist movement here is quite different to the suffragettes, but I like to think of her as a dangerous woman, of publicising these really subversive ideas. Are we familiar with this? Yeah? This is a Tom Roberts painting. It's from that period. This is probably what we're more likely to consider when we think of Australian identity, and also probably when we think about the 1890s period. It comes out of that sort of identification of a distinctive Australian art form and distinctive Australian light. And you can see that this is a very male scene, I would say, and it's also a celebration of that sort of rural worker.
With bad luck to have women in insurance, even up until this
Goodness
century.
me. Goodness me. So we'll just say thank you to the National Gallery of Victoria, and I think I've managed to get all of us, museums, libraries, archives, and
I think you have.
thank you.
Done.
So I wanted to, in this section I was sort of thinking, well, I'll just bring up things that are probably more familiar to us during this period, and so that was, you know, the Tom Roberts quite famous painting. And I thought, oh, I'll bring up something from the Bulletin. I was like, oh, well, they all kind of look the same, right? Something common there?
It's blokey.
It's a little blokey. It's a little beard heavy, isn't it?
It's
Like those are all different pages.
They all look really unhappy.
It was tough being a man in the 1890s.
Oh,
Women were wanting rights and stuff. It was just so you can see that the Bulletin it probably has a distinctive tone, I would say, to what is going on here. But again, it's that sort of bulletin that comes through as being that archetype of the 1890s and our understanding of what was happening in the literary world during that period. And it's the kind of thing that provokes, you know, an institution to, and I didn't tweet this, again, this is me away from my institution, but that an institution can tweet about Louisa Lawson, the publishing work that she did, show an original record of her, and the response is something like this. So the reason why I've sort of taken us through that sort of process and our understanding of 1890s, where that sits in the historical record, is to bring us to the fight or the campaign that was launched for the digitisation of the Dawn. So the digitisation of the Dawn stems from a campaign that was put together by Donna Benjamin 5 years ago. So Donna was doing some research into women in information technology, and she went, well, printing press is part of that. Louisa Lawson had her own printing house. She sacked all the men and put women in, and the unions went nuts. Yeah, so, you know, Louisa Lawson, great candidate. Let's access the Dawn. And the Dawn wasn't digitised. So she called the library and she said, are there any plans for the Dawn to be digitised? And she was told no. But if you get a funding source together, there's a possibility that it can happen. So she did. So she put together an online campaign and she sought funding from people, and she was successful. And the Dawn has been digitised for over 5 years and is available on Trove. But the key aspect of this is to question why, when she asked, there was funding put aside for the Bulletin, but not the Dawn. You know, why is it that the Bulletin and those male artists are what we remember about the period, and yet this, which is so important to our understanding and of that period and also to an Australian identity, why is this not a priority? So we'll just thank Donna for her work. And you can also follow at Digitize the Dawn, so it now tweets out articles from the Dawn, and it's an absolute delight. So Louisa Lawson was quite a canny publisher, so she realised that perhaps Pure Politics wasn't always going to sell enough magazines, so it's interspersed with you know, things you would find in other women's journals as well. So it's quite a delight. So this is a deliberately full screen because what emerged from Donna's talk, and it was recorded at the same conference, so you can go online and watch the talk, and there's an awful lot of crowd engagement. So what emerged from here was a sort of list or items for discussion or consideration, and it was very interesting in the context of a crowd that was not glam. So we were talking to an audience mostly made up of sort of software engineers or developers or anyone interested in open access, and the glam portion of the audience was very, very minimal. So for them, one of the big things was, well, like, what do you mean stuff's like it's not all digitized? What do you mean? Is there a backlog? You know, how can we get vocal about it? It's like, oh my goodness. Oh, you know, it's this completely different world to where we exist, where the portion of digitized to non-digitized is like, you know, so vast, and that's potentially not perceived, and we possibly need to do more about that. But they wanted to know, how are records chosen for digitization? So how are records chosen for digitization? Anyone in your institution? Pardon? Many offices.
I don't know how they choose which is up for digitisation.
Do you think that's problematic?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So of course there are internal policies, so you can jump onto, for example, the National Library's website and have a look at their prioritisation. I imagine State Library has the same sort of thing. So there are policies that are out there. But if we, the public, don't know and don't have a voice in that, is that problematic? Are we digitising material that reinforces a comfortable narrative, right? How do we...
Point is that's a very pertinent point.
Yeah.
The whole Anne Zachary thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So that fourth point, how do we overcome the pervasive militarisation of the historical record and associated prioritisation of funding in this area? So again, digitisation is dependent on funding. Funding is allocated. There are many different ways funding can be allocated. And of course, we saw a huge amount of funding come through to commemorate World War I. And so we have a almost sort of disproportionate amount of digitised content that tells that story. Now, from one perspective, that story is often non-inclusive. It celebrates a very masculine Australian identity, that sort of understanding of Anzac-ary and unpacking that. So I'm not, I'm just saying that in Australian identity, that bush legend sort of comes together with the Anzac legend to create a very masculine identity that celebrates egalitarianism and a healthy disregard for authority and all of those kind of concepts.
It's also,
Yes.
particularly in the Anzac thing, it's
Yeah.
particularly about the campaigns.
Yeah.
It's very little about what happened here
Yeah,
in that period of time.
yeah,
What the families went through.
What the families went through, what the women went through, what
Yeah.
people were doing.
yeah,
That doesn't seem to be, because that doesn't fit the narrative.
yeah. So it does come down to narrative, and I think we have a role as institutions to think about how we contribute to, or make ready the opportunity to tell a different story. So of course within our institutions we are bound by all sorts of all sorts of structures, and we might not necessarily be able to come forward and give or promote uncomfortable or disruptive narratives, but what we can do is possibly digitise a range of resources and invite researchers and historians and those trained in critical theory into our institutions to tell those other narratives. You know what I mean? So it's sort of, you sort of have your cake and eat it too. But I think that idea of involving the ordinary person, or involving the small community, or involving the alternative voice into the decision making is a really important thing too. So some people I talk to about the digitisation process in their institution will sort of say, oh, well, we just kind of send an email around and we just ask what people think, and then that kind of makes up the agenda. And is that necessarily best practice? So those are some of the questions that emerged from it. One of the ideas that some people from Open Access Australia thought would be a great idea is to sort of collate a list of non-digitised content. So have a very public list, and have public engagement with regards to moving things up or down a priority list. I mean, it's a sort of utopian idea when you have single institutions doing their own digitisation, and how does that connect across a national or even international spectrum. But it's something to consider, and it's an external voice to GLAM. It's people on the front of open access, people on the front of the digital world, but sitting outside of GLAM. So giving us some things to think about there. Was there any other thoughts on these particular questions, or from your perspective in your own institutions?
My brain just sort of exploded, sorry.
That's no good. But even just as individuals, so I'm sure that we all have our own interests or our own personal histories, and we would like to see those sort of stories come through, or at least have the ability to put forward.
I'm waiting for Stanthorpe, the newspaper from Stanthorpe in Queensland, to use it.
Right.
I've discovered there's a family connection back to there.
Yeah. So where is it on the priority list?
I don't know.
You don't know. Okay, so is that problematic? Do we need a way of...
Yeah, if I know it's coming next year, then I've only got a year to wait. If I know it's coming 5 years, then
What if you knew that there was something you could do to bring it up the list?
Yeah.
Okay.
And has it been collected in the first place?
Sorry?
Has it been collected physically in the first place?
As far as I know, it has. As far as I know, it has.
Because the underlying question to all this is, yes, we have priorities about what we don't digitise, but we also had priorities at the time about what we didn't collect.
Absolutely.
So,
Yeah,
what
absolutely.
we are able to prioritise about digitisation may not be as effective as it works because we don't have material in the first
Yeah,
place.
this is true, and we might have a narrative that we want to support, but we didn't collect, and that in itself is problematic. And I think talking about our critical thinking earlier, having a look at our collecting policies and understanding that at certain times that certain voices were privileged,
Yes.
and those voices might not reflect what we necessarily want in this day and age.
There's also the issue of who, like if you have your local newspaper and you want to digitise, who do you ask?
Who do you ask?
Do you ask the local historical society if you've got one? Do you ask the state library? Do you ask the national library? You know, you might get different answers from all three of those people. They're probably all going to say that you can't afford it, in which case the onus is then back on you, the individual, to try and make that happen like Donna did. And I feel like it shouldn't be up to the individual to press the local, state, national collecting institutions, and I say that as an employee of one of them, to...
But we can sit separate to our institutions.
Exactly.
Yep.
Yeah, but you know, it shouldn't be on the individual person to say, I want this digitized, because then of course other people who don't know that they can say this or don't know how to, their voices aren't heard, and then their things aren't digitized.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it becomes a, you know, squeaky wheel gets the grease in this kind of situation, which has its pros and cons.
Yeah, and I think we also need a mechanism too to join like-minded people as well. So I might be campaigning for this in, you know, the mountains, and you might be campaigning it where you are, and, you know, they're the same thing, but we've got two separate campaigns, and, you know, so we're really...
A way of bringing those all together.
Just a comment from New Zealand.
Yay! Hi, New Zealand!
Saying that something that's been happening in New Zealand is sharing the digitisation efforts to avoid that sort of double up, obviously, resources, etc.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting one. I'm not sure if we've got it there, but we have the sort of big players, you know, and we do operate under a competitive funding model, which I totally disagree with. I think we should have a collective approach to funding, but are we ready to destroy the system? Not yet. Join me for the revolution. But while we do have that that competitive funding model, it is going to be possibly difficult for those smaller groups to sort of get a piece of that pie. So what onus is there on the large collecting institutions to work with smaller historical societies or you know, fringe groups in different areas to also help them in that digitisation process? And how do we do it? How do we go about it? Any answers?
Oh, I thought you were posing the question.
No, it's just, it is something to think about there. Starting the revolution?
Yeah.
Is that the answer?
It's always the answer.
That's the only answer, all right.
And so we're back to killing people.
It's a glam event
Just
after
about
all.
how many you kill.
Oh,
Come to
goodness.
Glamour.
Kill a few, it's murder, you kill one, it's not always.
Okay, yeah. So again, my sort of take on this, and I know that we'll finish up real quick, but again, is to, you know, wear this discussion. So again, this dress is not just the dawn, it's not just 1890s Australia, it's not even just Australian feminist history, it's also our understanding of open access, about digitisation priorities, the narrative that GLAM supports, okay? Yes?
Where do you get it printed?
Yes. Oh, okay.
Answer the big question. Never mind the funding models.
Sorry.
Well,
Chuck
one's
the
a
door.
dress museum.
But what are the underlying physical items?
Yeah, okay, so what I do is I use spoon flour. So spoon flour in the US. So you can design what you like, you upload your image, you choose the fabric. So this is a drill, cotton drill, whereas that's another cotton but a different type of weave. And it just gets printed and mailed out to you. So it's actually a really simple process. I have my next project. I actually want to take the process back into my own hands. So I want to sort of learn how to screen print, and I want to do the printing myself. It's again taking that, you know, I was talking to someone else about the process of what we wear and whether this is ever neutral. And I would say that it's never ever neutral, because we make so many decisions about what we wear, even in terms of understanding the labour, you know. So who made this? I made this, and it took me, you know, I don't know, 10 hours or whatever it is. But I know that the labour was my own, and I have not exploited anyone in that process. Can I say the same about the cotton? No, because I haven't done the research into where the cotton is sourced, or, you know, the level of printing. So if I take back that process, I take that back into my own hands. Does that make sense? It's sort of that critical analysis of what's happening. But again, same sort of approach with this, and bringing in a few of those other hashtags. So Trove has been using the Made with Trove hashtag to sort of bring collectively together the stuff that people are doing with Trove records. So if you do make anything from Trove, use that. And I've also got critical making as a hashtag there. That term came out of Tim Sherritt's response to the wearing access presentation, and I just really like the term a lot because I think it sums up, you know, it's not just making an item, it's actually critically thinking about the process. There's the finished dress, but you can see that on me, so I didn't really need this. Plus it's got a wrong word in the title. So in summing up, what I want us to think of is when we think in terms of people engaging with our records, and we look back at the redaction art example. So that engagement happened outside of the repository, right? So it happened not only outside of the physical building, but also even outside of their digital presence, okay? So I want us to, you know, think about engagement with records as being beyond citations. It's beyond website clicks, you know, it is often beyond what we can measure from our systems. Increasingly, engagement is happening outside of the institution, and not just the physical sense, but also the digital presence as well. So we as institutions need new ways of sort of measuring that level of engagement, because as we've seen, engagement is reflective, it is critical, and it is creative, right? Engagement is a cookie, engagement is a tattoo, engagement is a brooch, and engagement is a dress. So we need to think about the ways that we measure that, okay? And that is my summing up. Are there any questions around, or anything you want to share or contribute, or yes?
So you know I've been working on some Trove projects.
Yeah.
My hassle is working out what is free to use and what is still copyrighted and what you have to attribute, and that's challenging.
Yeah, so I think there's
Wait till January 1.
Yeah. It's going to be amazing, isn't it? Yeah. So my perspective is, and again I speak as an individual here, is I think that libraries have done quite a bit to put the onus of determining copyright onto the user. So what in Tim's example was that he said this collection of items is free to, you know, do with what you want. And I think a little bit more of that from institutions of having very clear reuse symbols. You know, this is copyright free, this is reuse with attribution. And just as we in our library management system signal to the user that this item is a book, this item is a video, this item is available, this is on loan, we also signal with our digitized content, this is open access, this is reuse, you know, with attribution only. This is, do you know what I mean? So having very visual signifiers as well, and possibly taking a bit more of that on ourselves as institutions.
A lot of my local stuff is like, oh yeah, it's online, but if you want to do anything with it, you have to apply written permission to reuse it. I'm like, I'm not going to write it. I know the lady, but I'm not going to write it to her and say, I want to use this.
Yeah.
I think there's also another avenue for glam in that there is, like you've done with the dress, there's so much stuff that you can use that people just don't know that you can.
Yes, yeah.
It's not so much, well, what can I do with it?
Yeah.
It's, oh, I can do that.
Oh, I can do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think too that we've often taken a sort of cautious approach. So, you know, when we look at Trove was a risk. The digitisation of those newspapers was a risk. But it was judged to be a risk worth taking. And I think they've only had 1 or 2 actual takedowns. And that's their sort of thing. You know, if you request a takedown, okay, well, we'll take it down. So it's sort of assessing that as well. And I mean...
Yeah, because I think you're right. We forget how risky the idea of Trove was when it first was announced.
Yeah.
Because they went to international conferences and said, this is what we're doing. We're going to get people to edit it. And they just went,
what? Yeah.
You can't.
And
They'll
now,
do idiot things.
yeah, we can't trust the public.
Yeah, idiots. The public are idiots. They'll do it. No. They'll be, and it's worked out fine.
Of course, yeah.
And then, like, the people who do the $1.7 billion changes a week or whatever,
I know.
are insane.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that example is that we could be a little bolder and take a few more risks. But yeah, come next year.
Yeah, there's going to be millions of stuff.
It's going to be amazing. It's going to be amazing.
So the Reich Museum has a capacity where you can take, which is getting off Trove, but it's kind of the same. But the Reich Museum, you can go searching for their images, which are all out of copyright because masters have done it. So you can go and get their stuff, pull their image off, and then reuse it in a dress or whatever.
Yeah, yeah.
So you can do all sorts of stuff with that stuff. So it's out of copyright, obviously. So why can't we do that with some of the stuff in the National Art Gallery or the New South Wales Art Gallery, whatever?
Yeah, I think
it's the potential is huge.
Yeah, I think
it's just letting people know that that's what you can do with it.
It's letting people know and letting people know that they're okay to do it. Yeah. So how do we signal to users that that's what it is? And I think one of the things is to actually celebrate what people do. Yeah. So, you know, like an institution retweeting an individual or having again, the power of the unifying hashtag. So made with Trove, made with SLNSW. So when you create something using their content, you put it on social media using that tag, and the institution, there needs to be a relationship. So it can't all be one way. The institution needs to acknowledge what you've done with that content. And I mean, a retweet's not that hard. So a bit more of acknowledgement and encouraging a community of use and reuse, I think, is really important.
Maybe we also need to talk to the creators, whoever they are, and say, look, this is stuff you can do.
Yeah.
And figure it out.
I think a broader conversation with all of our users is necessary. So, I mean, I include in that, say, academics or researchers who often talk about discoveries, you know, or in the dusty archives. Well, how did you discover it? Was it actually the metadata behind it that helped that happen? You know, was it the...
Or did you just walk down the dusty archive? Look, say put the third on the left, second on the right. There it is.
So we know that there would have been the metadata behind that. We know that there was probably a finding aid that you used and X, Y, Z. So that rhetoric of finding or discovery in or unearthed or all of those kind of things negates the work that's been done. So if we have more of an open dialogue where researchers are able to say, well, I used, as I did in this presentation, acknowledging all of the archives, the galleries, the libraries and museums where I pulled content, if we have this relationship of, I have used your stuff in this, and the institution has said, great, look, such and such has used our stuff in this, and we have a bit more of a sharing community as opposed to the separate silos that seem to exist a bit.
Doesn't it raise their profile to their funding bodies anyway?
Yeah. I mean, I can't see any negatives in it, right?
Well, see, if Trove go, hold on a second, no one's using our stuff, it's not going to keep getting funded.
Yeah, so, I mean, having that...
Hypothetically, if no one was using it,
and
no ways of proving that our stuff's actually getting used, it's not going to continue.
Yeah.
But it is getting used. I go log on, it's like, 36,000 searches in the last hour, and this is like at 7 o'clock in the morning or something.
Yeah, but again, even just having that data really visible, and we've seen State Library of New South Wales and also State Library of Queensland having their Unstacked program that shows that real-time searching. So it's not just about people queued at the reference desk, it's actually the engagement that's happening online as well. So more a promotion of those kind of aspects of engagement, I guess. And it's that different ways of engaging.
And simple ways of work that DX Lab does at the State Library.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's just highlighting what's in the collection.
Yeah, so if you've seen the Loom, they show, they have a nice sort of visualization of how much is digitised versus how much is not digitised. And of course that not digitised is much, much larger. But it's often, again, that thinking outside of GLAM that if it's not digitised, it doesn't exist. And it's sort of showing, well, actually that's not the case. And also, can we have some more money, please? Is there anything else? Done.
Well, thank you very